All right, our next speaker is just a fun person. We're real thrilled to have Patty Limerick. I won't even mention the statist or anything. For those of you who've been kind of following the perspective section in the Denver Post, it's really a joy to read her regular columns there. We're thrilled to have Patty Limerick here to give us some of her unique perspectives on the evolution of Colorado's water. Patty.
Oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't fence me in.
That was a really clever idea of Doug's to have these theme songs. I have to say, it's not a hard choice for me. Don't fence me in is the obvious choice, I guess. But I'm really delighted to be here. And thank you, Doug, and thank you all the members of the Colorado Water Congress for this opportunity. I was thinking through my remarks. I remember at a time, the very first time I ever went to a convention, I was, I think, maybe 19 or 20, and there was a banquet. And at the banquet, we had a speaker, and he was very lively and very engaging. I was, again, the youngest person in the room, I think, and when he finished, I had not been able to figure out what his topic was. So I turned to the adults at my table. I said, I must have drifted for a moment there. What was this man's subject matter or expertise or area? And they said, oh, he doesn't have that. He's an inspirational speaker. Well, as a 20-year-old, I thought, that is very peculiar. And then I turned into one. So that is really, young people take a lesson from that. And speaking of young people, I do want to report that I was fortunate to bring two students from CU who are very, very interested in water issues, Vincent Robo and Martin Sarley, and they've been with me. And I asked them for their impressions, and I think you would find it just inspirational and delightful to know what they thought. They enjoyed every moment. They could not imagine a better situation for networking. And they both remarked on what I don't know if I should say relief or joy it was to be with people from different political positions trying to solve problems. One of them said that he really did not know where else he could go to find this kind of range of opinion, but people coming together to try to talk it through, understand each other, and come together. He said the only other organization he had heard of that did that was the Western Governors Association, and they had never invited him to come. So there's a competitive advantage right there. But I really thank you for the stuff Pond is doing. That's a wonderful thing. It seems very different from other areas where that inclusion of young people is not as vigorous as it is here. So my basic pitch today is the value of history. The slogan of our Center of the American West is turning hindsight into foresight. So I will be trying to do that, looking at several big issues of the divide between production and consumption of resources, and particularly water, looking at the rural-urban divide, looking at some issues of public awareness, of durability issues and maintenance. So collaboration and its value in really is a great test experiment in the compatibility of democracy and natural resource management and allocation. So I'll be doing that, and I will also be offering some, I guess we'll just call them eccentric, forms of public education. And I will say, just to warn you ahead of time, a couple of them are supposed to be jokes, but I've had one or two people take them seriously and think that they weren't particularly practical ideas, but they are jokes. But the point, I think one or two of them are actually quite practical, and the whole point is to loosen up the notion of what education might consist of as we reach to the public on this. So my topic, good heavens, the evolution of Colorado's water infrastructure. We would be here for days and days. That is an ambitious topic. Happily, the core point I would want to make as a historian is how much the story of the evolution of Colorado's water infrastructure is an anti-fatalism delivery device. If you go back 200 years and you look at Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long, the first American explorers to come into Colorado, or what became Colorado, their expeditions reached the conclusion that this was an area that would not support American settlement. So both of those explorers 200 years ago said, it's not going to happen here. This is a barrier to the expansion of the United States. Neither of those people has won awards over time as prophets. In fact, they are wonderful cautionary tales, and that's, I guess, the whole point. Because if you go back to that prediction, which was not the dumbest prediction anyone ever made, they looked at the landscape. They'd arrived here in summer. That didn't look like there would be any support for agriculture. They'd missed the runoff, so no wonder they flubbed this. And to go back and look at that prediction is to reassert wonder, astonishment, recognition of improbability in the outcome that we have with us. Neither of those individuals had much sense at all of what the profession of engineering would become, so that would be one place where their predictions went off. We are in a state of affairs where the arrangements of water are constant reminders that this would have been impossible to predict or even imagine 200 years ago. I call that an anti-fatalism delivery device because, in fact, we have on historical record a transformation beyond predictions. So many people living happy, contented lives in this region where Pike and Long said it simply can't happen. So it is a strong argument against fatalism. It makes, in fact, fatalism in a sense of inevitability. It puts that off limits. So if we mobilize historians, we get a lot of things. We get a remedy for fatalism. That's no small offering. I don't really know what other profession you would go to. Would you go to a neurologist or a hypnotist? I have no idea. But whatever you would get from the hypnotist, I think, is not as substantive and lasting as what you would get from the historian. So let's go now on the next historical subject to the disconnect between production and consumption. You heard me at the start of the Denver water film using my phrase that seems just slow in catching on as a household phrase. I don't doubt that it will happen eventually, I assure you, by the third time you say it, it's with you forever, okay? Ready? The era that we have been living for the last 110 years, 120 years or so, in the era of improbable comfort made possible by a truly astonishing but taken for granted infrastructure. Very tempting. And a very poor use of time to have you all chant that with me, so I will not do that, but it really rolls off the tongue after 3 or 4 tracks. And it's very important because that is the key to the production-consumption disconnect. So the big project, historically generated project, a project that really only becomes manageable and makes sense when you include historians, is now before us, and many of you have been speaking of that, easing the public out of complacency and obliviousness. So, and those are both rather enjoyable states, I think. People who get into that really are not joyful about being invited out of complacency and out of obliviousness. So what might we do? Actually, I was going to say, and I urge you, this is an analogy not to use, but it just is, I can't get it out of my head when I am thinking about the American public's attitude towards the people who supply them with services and commodities, namely engineers. And that's why I proposed the Limerick solution, which is that no dinner party is complete until you've invited an engineer. Because you need to have someone who tells you where these extremely bright lights, I will say it's just a little bit more intense than I would have asked of engineers. In any case, to just remind us of how all of these opportunities and resources and commodities come to us. So the analogy I cannot keep myself from thinking about is that a good share, not all by any means, but a good share of urban, suburban, and ex-urban Westerners bear a certain resemblance to spoiled teenagers. They have a lot, they get the car keys, they do stuff they like very much, and they get quite crabby if something comes in the way of that. And so how do we ease them out? Well, I'm going to give just one quick suggestion because I do have other things I want to get to as well. But I think this is a plan that is on the borders of maybe take it as a joke and maybe take it as practical and something to work on and get into action. So we start with one day a year where we recruit the restaurants in urban Colorado. And when the waiter comes to your table and says, would you like sparkling water, bottled water, or would you like tap water? If the person says, which I think most people say, oh, tap water, we would like that. The waiter then says, I am sorry to say I cannot give you that tap water. I would like very much to bring it to you, but I cannot do that until you can prove to me that you know where the water comes from. And then, at this point, Doug, this is important for you, the Colorado Water Congress has mobilized on behalf of that special day. And if a satisfactory answer is produced by the person who wants the water, then the waiter is entitled to hand out a Colorado Water Congress certificate of alertness and recovery from obliviousness to the diner. And those become very competitive. People are very proud to have those, and they make their friends feel bad for not having them. So there's a lot of that going on in other arenas. So, okay, so that's one idea. Now I would like to turn to my next topic, which is durability and maintenance. This is a very, there's nothing that's really, I don't mean anything condemnatory about this in hindsight, but when I look back at the ceremonies as an historian, at the completion of major infrastructure projects in Colorado, I look back at that and I think, it was very nice. Miss Colorado finally, well, she was often there breaking a bottle of champagne on the dam and so on. Nice rituals, nice forms of congratulation, recognition of the people who had workmen as well as the designers and all that. That was very nice, but one major ceremony or one major ritual was left out of those ceremonies. There should have been, and again, this is not really meant as, I'm not criticizing the people of the past for this, but I am saying it was an omission, and it's an omission we have to rectify now. We missed the part at those ceremonies where someone stood up at the end of the ceremony and said, maybe at a little bit of length, now the process of construction is done, and now the responsibility moves over to you citizens. Within a very short time, the construction has ended, and the maintenance demands our attention and your funding. So we could have had Miss Colorado deliver that remark. That would have been very beautiful and very charming to have such a lovely person, so nicely dressed, give those remarks at the various dam dedications. But that is what architects know. I was married to an architect. My late husband was an architect. As soon as you've finished building a house, there is a quick shift to maintaining that house and keeping it vertical and keeping it held up. So that is something that's omitted, and now the public is surprised that we have to direct resources to maintenance. Another certificate in the making there, I don't know, of a recognition of that. Now for a really big part of that production, of the separation between production and consumption, I want to go to the rural-urban split, which is certainly an issue in nearly everything that has come up in our time together and in many previous meetings. So, as an historian, I can say this, I believe, with a lot of evidence behind it, that historically, in not just the Euro-American settlement of the West, but in Indian life, well, now and before the arrival of Euro-Americans, the rural and urban ways of living were quite interconnected. There was a very robust system of trade with pueblos and more nomadic people in Indian America. In the settlement of the West by Euro-Americans, there was an unmistakable connection that if you have a rural enterprise, you will need a town to have, to where you take the product of your farm or the product of your mine or whatever, and a place where you get your equipment, buy your equipment, and also a place where you socialize and feel a sense of reconnection to people with whom you don't work immediately every day. So the rural and urban Wests were not separate entities. I mean, they were certainly separate entities, but they were very intertwined. And it was unmistakable that if you had a mine, then you would bring in, then farmers would come in order to supply that mining town, because the one thing that does not come from the subsurface is much in the way of edible food. So truffles, I don't know, there's a few things, but not very many things, and you can't really live on that. So the rural-urban split is a historical development in fairly recent times, and it is unfortunate. So what do we do about this urban-rural divide? I'm going direct not to more historical reflections on that with the limits of time, but to talk about things in which we can address that history, which again over the last 100 years or so, and accelerating maybe in recent times, has gone into a division that is not good, that is not tenable, and is not in our interest. So I'm happy to say that my organization, Center of the American West, is about to offer an unusual form of remedy. For several years in the mid-1990s, we did a program some people might actually have seen it, on the urban-rural divorce. I played Urbana Asphalt West. A friend played Sandy Green Hills West. We had a child who'd been raised with very little discipline or structure, Suburbia Green Lawn West. And the three of us traveled around. We probably did it 40 or 45 times around the West and quite a few times in Colorado, where Sandy asked for a divorce from Urbana. And indeed, through that, you can see some very good reasons why that seemed like a good idea from Sandy's point of view to cut that tie. And then we would go through our arguments, and then, oh my goodness, there's so many funny stories, and I do not have the time to tell them, but also illuminating and serious stories. It gave people a framework for talking about this. I will say that, I guess I'll call it disturbing, because it was, when we did it in cities. We did it in Portland, Oregon, we did it in Denver, we did it in Boise. It was very common for the urban residents to come up afterwards and say to us, we didn't know that the rural people had these concerns. Another certificate in the making here, I guess, too. I don't know, it's not the universal solution. But we felt that we had given communities a chance to recognize this. So what we're doing now, we're going out of the divorce trial thing, not to say a thing against the lawyers in the room here, but the trial didn't give us the room we wanted. So now we have a very, very overburdened marriage counselor who is working with the Urbana and Sandy and Suburbia. And there's pretty good news that Suburbia has grown up in some ways and has recognized some responsibility that Suburbia has for our circumstances. And in any case, we now have what's going to be a kit. Your community can get this urban-rural counseling session kit. You can modify it to your own place's interests. You can get, I'm a Rotarian. Rotarians are always good for these things. You can get Rotarians to play the parts, and you can use it in your own area or perform it in other places. So that is one way to take the divide and put it in a framework where we can think productively about it. And it has, I believe, produced, when we did it in the past, I think it came to some good use. So one of the things that will be in our new version of the script, which was not there 20 years ago, we were not clever enough to think of this, one example of how much these two supposedly opposed forms of human community, how they are intertwined. It's no news to anybody here that one of the principal drivers of urban and suburban growth on the Front Range is the recognition of people looking for a good place to live, that if they move to the urban Front Range, they will have extraordinary proximity to scenic open spaces and places for recreation. Why are those open spaces understood to be beautiful, attractive to the eye, and uplifting to the soul? In lots and lots of places in rural Colorado, it is farming and ranching that is the key to the preservation and persistence of the open horizon that gives those places such a sense of beauty. So, alfalfa is particularly aesthetically pleasing as a green, open landscape. When people in the Front Range discuss the use of irrigation water for the raising of hay and alfalfa for cattle, it's often in a form of dismay over the efficiency of that use and how many calories of meat are produced with that could be more providing of human sustenance if it went to other products. That's the usual framework. It is equally important, I think, for the well-being of Coloradans and the economy of Colorado for so much of our landscape to be kept with stretches of open green expanse extending to the foothills and mountains. It's what America the Beautiful, what the song celebrates. So, and I also have been at water conferences where I have heard presentations on how difficult it is and how expensive it is to revegetate with native vegetation if you dewater a farm. If for some reason you think that's the right thing to do, that is one hard process to do the revegetation. So that alone, just this small item here I've been mentioning about the beauty of landscapes and farming, that could, I believe, put rural-urban conversations on a different footing and a different understanding. In the Denver Water book, Ditch in Time, I did write quite a beautiful limerick on this subject, which I shall, I'm not what you would call a poet, but with the surname Limerick, I have no no escape from the obligations of art. I'm driven to art. If this is art, I don't think it's art, but here it is. So here we go for this limerick. Rural and urban places are tangled together like laces. They're like sister and brother. They depend on each other. They have never been opposite cases. So ideas, how about dude farming? It worked with dude ranching. So I have more ideas on that, but you get the general picture. More active manipulation of the locavore trend. It's a little goofy in some ways, but it's really got tremendous power of engagement. People care a great deal about that. There's a good opportunity there. Okay, so that's the rural-urban section. And now I'm going on with the, I've done worse in time control. I'll just tell you that I have just 2 or 3 more things I want to shoehorn in here. On the great experiment that this community is involved in with enormous consequence for democracy. That experiment is exploring the relationship between democracy and processes of arriving at priorities and strategies for natural resource management and allocation. In 21 seconds, I will say a lot of what we consider to be more foresighted forms of resource management actually originated in very top-down centralized authority. So kings, aristocrats, their estates, colonial governors going to distant parts of the planet and imposing resource regimes. There is an undemocratic origin to some of these really quite valuable and wonderful strategies of long-term thinking. So the great experiment here has accelerated in the last 40 or 50 years with the passage of environmental laws that require public participation, public input. 2 short words, actually the one word is quite long, but public participation, just a few syllables, and such a complicated practice, such a hard thing to figure out how to do in the proper way. Many people have said it's important for people to feel listened to. Well, then what happens after what is the product of the listening? Where does that go? So many interesting consequential questions. There is a premium on public input that has accelerated. How do we do this effectively and efficiently? There is much experimentation. There is no settled answer. So when I heard here several times the question about what is the relationship between the CWCB and the roundtables and the Interbasin Compact Committee, I thought, go at it. This is great. You are in the midst of a really important, historically consequential enterprise. Those 2 tracks and many others in watershed coalitions and more dispersed locations, that's a really big deal. And that could have enormous implications for not only the nation, but the planet. So here's my historian's it's such a nice thing to say to you. I can't believe how, you're going to be very happy after I've said this. You're just going to think, thank you, Doug. We're just so happy that you brought this odd person here to speak. So here we are. When you were having a tough day, when you were engaged in these processes of public participation and representing different constituencies and forums, trying to reach consensus, when you were having a tough day, think of yourself, because this is accurate, as a major figure in Western American history. You may tell your family members that evening. You may say, you don't realize that the person who's joined you for dinner is quite a consequential person. Because, and it's true, because you are volunteering to take part, and you are taking part in a very important experiment in exploring the relationship between democracy and natural resource management and allocation. And my counterparts, historians of the future, are going to be really grateful to you. And they will want your records. Patty, where's Patty Reddig from CSU? Well, wherever she is so eager. I can't possibly see you. I can't. So, I mean, I always see you and enjoy seeing you, but I can't do that now because the engineers have maybe overproduced a little bit here on the lighting. So, a couple of last remarks here. How interesting it has been that a presenter from California on crisis and the use of crisis and the meaning of Cape Town. How interesting to have that Cape Town case study and to have not just him but others saying, don't waste a crisis. A crisis is a huge opportunity, And so the production of a guide, how to make the most of your crisis, how to welcome your next crisis because it is an opportunity. It's kind of a remarkable idea, and it has some irony and mockery, I guess, in it, but it doesn't. It's really how to say, here is our next moment. Here's a proposition. It's a prediction, and I've made fun of predictions, so it's questionable why I would do this now, but I am willing to bet pretty heavily that when crisis looms, if we mobilized historians, which is not our way with a crisis as a society, but if we mobilized historians, we could achieve longer lasting and more substantial gains from those crises. So what I dream of is historians, when we have a forest fire, when we have an onset of a drought, historians as first responders. SWAT teams of historians out there fast, not getting in the way of the firefighters or anything like that. God willing, we know how to. Well, most of the time, historians are never visible, so we're very good at staying out of the way. So, but in this case, we should be right there, and the teams of historians should be balanced towards the young. We have many young folks who would like to major in history. They are told, rightly, by their elders not to do it because there's no need for them, there's no jobs, they won't have an opportunity. Studying the American West, that's all we offer is historical perspective, and we are overwhelmed with opportunity. So we need to make sure that the young people who want to go into history get to do that because it matters to them, but more important because we need them. Because amnesia is bad news when it hits an individual. When you have a friend stricken with amnesia, you don't say, well, what a great situation for you. Every moment is fresh for you now. They're just not all haunted by the past. Boy, I wish I were you. That's really, well, you don't remember who I am, so okay, I can't wish I were you, but you just go directly to the emergency room and you find a neurologist. Well, what do you do when you have a society stricken by amnesia? That's just as serious, that's just as terrible a situation. Historians and giving young people that opportunity to follow up with that interest is huge. So I think this is my last item, is on poor Mark Twain. It's happened to me once or twice in the press or in dealing with publics that I have been misquoted, and sometimes quoted as saying something that seems really just unimaginably stupid. And there is my name. And there are worse troubles in life, so power on is the best approach there. But poor Mark Twain has had a terrible time, and he's not with us. I recognize that. He can't. Well, I have no idea whether he can feel the pain or not. How would I possibly know that? But he is poor soul. He is quoted and quoted and quoted and quoted with whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting. The people at the Twain papers at Berkeley say they cannot find any evidence he ever said that. It's not particularly witty in the Twain manner. You can kind of see it wasn't Mark Twain because it's true. Whiskey is for drinking. That's true. That's not a particularly witty remark. That's just a clear fact. And drinking in moderation. He could have said that, but he didn't. That wouldn't really have been very quotable either. But this premise, water is for fighting. Well, how do we know that? How do we know that? And there have been so many people. This recent book by Mr. Fleck, well, any number of people have said, actually, in many situations, water is too important for fighting. In international situations, sometimes it's not a thing, it just has to be figured out how to manage that resource. Too much is at stake. So the opportunity to rethink that premise, let poor Twain, there are so many hundreds and thousands of things that Twain said that were witty, and so we must get those out and cite those for justice sake. But it is just an extraordinary opportunity when you look at things like the fact that many people have mentioned here, without a robust form of alliance building and collaboration between the different state sections and parts of our state, it's an absolute divide and conquer situation with the Colorado River Compact and the claim that Colorado can make on the water of the upper basin. So there's such an incentive there to come together because there's every reason why a united state of Colorado will do better. So in any case, that's the thing. We did a workshop. Southern American West did a workshop in June. We brought historians together. It's our drought workshop. It was sponsored by NOAA, and not the biblical figure, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, though I don't know, NOAA and floods, he might have been into it. He might have wanted to do something with us on that. So the drought workshop, we brought 20 historians together, Western historians, to put forward case studies of where in the last couple of centuries, Westerners have confronted drought. Under what circumstances have they collaborated? Under what circumstances have they turned against each other and fought for whatever they could get? The case studies are abundant on cooperation. There are case studies on the lack of that. So that is an astounding opportunity to get examples from historians, to turn hindsight into foresight, and to have a really down-to-earth set of guidelines on how to take the crisis and how to make the most of the crisis and to build as much in the way of community. This is maybe the first time I can remember in my life that I have 3 seconds and I'm stopping.